My name is Alison LaRocca, and in this presentation, I will be introducing the value for investment approach, often referred to as VFI, and walking you through what it is, how it works, and most importantly, the key decision points evaluators must consider when applying it in practice. My goal is to help you understand not only the concepts, but also what it looks like to use VFI in real evaluation contexts. Value for investment lives at the intersection of evaluation and economics. It blends explicit evaluative reasoning with economic methods. Unlike more traditional, narrow economic methods, VFI is not limited to only asking questions that produce monetary valuations of program outcomes. Instead, the central question it poses is what is the merit, worth, and significance of how resources are being used. VFI offers a structured way to draw defensible, evaluative conclusions about resource use in often complex social programs. The VFI approach was developed by Dr. Julian King, an evaluator and an economist based in New Zealand. Between the early 2000s and 2019, King recognized that there were two key issues that he continued to encounter as in his work as an economist and an emerging evaluator. He found that traditional cost-benefit analysis approaches were not suited to many social programs. Also, the term value for money, or VFM, as it's often referred to, was widely used internationally, but was rarely defined, and it was difficult for evaluators to apply the work of value for money consistently. He embarked on doctoral research that systematically examined these gaps and resulted in a formal articulation of the VFI model. Since then, this approach has been adopted by governments, philanthropic organizations, and increasingly evaluation practitioners across multiple countries. Dr. King has many of the resources around VFI, including evaluation reports, the dissertation, and the continued resources and research that is being amassed to develop this approach, all on his website listed on this slide. VFI has three main purposes. First, it helps evaluators make transparent, well-reasoned judgments about whether an intervention is a good use of resources. Second, it supports decision makers who need to allocate resources across competing priorities. And third, it helps improve programs by clarifying where value is being created or where it's being lost. The core question that VFI is always coming back to answer is, given the context and the alternatives, does this program represent good resource use and good value? VFI rests on 5 guiding principles, all centered around the logic of evaluation. First, it uses a participatory process in the design and implementation of the evaluation, meaning that interest holders are involved in defining what value means through the establishment of criteria and the development of performance standards to measure performance within those criteria. Secondly, it is a mixed methods approach because value cannot be understood from numbers alone, so it incorporates the qualitative experiences of interest holders in an evaluation process. Third, it prioritizes contextual appropriateness and really focuses on selecting methods that fit the situation rather than following a rigid formula. This includes when thinking about economic methods to determine the merit, worth, and significance of resource use. Economic methods are not always used in value for investment evaluations. It really depends on if it's an appropriate context for those methods to be used. Fourth, it emphasizes transparent evaluative conclusions, making the logic of the evaluation clear. So through the use of rubrics, value for investment is really able to show how judgments were reached and how that data was synthesized through the lens of the rubric to arrive at a conclusion. And finally, it represents a blending of economic and evaluative reasoning Ensuring that economic evidence fits within an evaluation framework and not the other way around, it really makes an effort to not have separate evaluation work be separated from economic work, and then they just kind of live next to each other, but it's really incorporating that economic reasoning into the data collection and the synthesis, so that they aren't considered as two separate activities, but really as one evaluation process. This diagram lays out the full 8-step value for investment model spanning both design and evaluation. Steps 1 through 4 are focused on defining value, so understanding the program, often through a theory of change, either developing one or refining one, setting criteria, developing standards, and determining the evidence needed to be able to adequately measure progress against those standards and criteria. Steps 5 through 8 involve gathering evidence, analyzing it, and synthesizing it across evidence streams, and then reporting. A key feature of VFI is that synthesis is its own deliberate step. This helps evaluators to resist making intuitive leaps to conclusions and ensures that judgments are explicitly tied to the rubrics and evidence that were built collectively with interest holders. When evaluators use VFI, each step involves a key decision point. In the first step, interest holders must be engaged in a facilitated process to determine a program's value proposition. Often this means, building a theory of change or refining a theory of change. It's critical in this step to ensure that multiple interest holders are represented and are included and invited to participate in this process. Step 2, we must decide which criteria capture good resource use in this particular context. Again, this is a facilitated planning process with interest holders, and also involves a lot of working together to figure out which values are the ones that get represented in the model and in the approach, and that deliberative process is very intentional and can also be very time intensive. Step 3, we then determine what excellent, good, adequate, or poor performance looks like for each criterion and build rubrics that reflect that, so that when data is collected, analyzed, and synthesized, there's a clear decision that's made through the lens of these rubrics to understand the levels of merit, worth, and significance. Step 4, a major decision point is whether to include an economic appraisal method or not, and importantly, which non-economic outcomes must also be captured. For example, which qualitative or experiential outcomes matter most to interest holders and must be included in an evaluation even if they cannot be monetized. The second half of the VFI model includes the actual implementation of the evaluation after the first planning phase. Step 5, we determine the best strategies to gather credible, complete data, recognizing that cost data may be complete or uneven. Step 6, evaluators must decide how to analyze qualitative, quantitative, and economic data separately before it's synthesized together. In step 7, this is one of the most important. How will conflicting evidence be weighed when applying the rubric? In this case, evaluators are making a lot of decisions about how to resolve discrepancies, how to merge, blend, and resolve data that may not perfectly align. And finally, in step 8, we decide which reporting format is best going to support real-world decision use, whether it's a rubric summary, a narrative explanation, shorter, more visual presentations, or perhaps longer, full traditional reports, or perhaps a combination of both. But the goal of this work is, because it's been so heavily informed by interest holder values, is that when a report format is chosen and executed, that it really reflects the utilization and the utility of decision making that interest holders are interested in receiving and being able to do from VFI evaluation. This slide shows an example from the International Atomic Energy Agency from a VFI evaluation that was done to show how VFI rubrics can operationalize value. Here, the criterion is economic benefits. The rubric clearly defines what counts as an excellent, good, adequate, or minor performance. The definitions blend economic evidence with thresholds based on interest holder expectations. Rubrics such as these ensure that evaluative reasoning is systematic and transparent, that there aren't really surprises with what the results will contain when a rubric is defined. That can help to organize that information systematically, and interest holders know what to expect throughout the implementation of an evaluation and in the reporting phase. Here's another rubric from the same evaluation, this time for infrastructure and research and development capacity. The performance levels specify the types of outputs and institutional changes expected at each level. This illustrates that VFI rubrics are not limited to economic outcomes, but they can capture scientific, social, organizational, or relational value just as clearly. So rubrics offer a way to take different types of evidence and be able to look at them next to each other comparatively through a similar systematic methodology. Value for investment have several strengths. It blends economic analysis with the general logic of evaluation, which traditionally has been separated, with neither one really fully serving the other to the extent of its potential. It aligns methods with context, making economic methods optional, not mandatory. It also uses participatory evaluation so interest holders can define what counts as value. It provides transparent evaluative reasoning by making criteria and standards explicit. So again, there are no surprises that emerge through VFI evaluations to understand, at least to understand how the data is being synthesized and worked with. It integrates qualitative and quantitative evidence through deliberative synthesis, and because it aligns evidence with actual decision needs, VFI often improves the likelihood that findings will actually be used in the course of these decisions where people are deciding how to allocate resources, how to refine programs, how to continue them, how to expand them, which has to take into account how that happens through the resources that are available. Finally, it's compatible with many other approaches. It can be used with utilization-focused evaluation. It can be used with culturally responsive evaluation, theory-driven evaluation. It invites all of those different approaches to fit within this framework in this context, centering interest holder value and the ability to think about all of these things in the context of resource allocation and use. VFI also has limitations. It can be challenging to compare programs because criteria are context-specific. There's still limited guidance on matching methods to context, especially for new evaluators. And because this is a relatively new and evolving approach, there are fewer established tools in existence. Rubric development requires substantial time from interest holders, so this is something that can be a limitation. People may not have the time to be able to spend, really engaged in planning these heavy facilitation processes. Cost data may be incomplete or inaccurate, limiting the economic analysis that is available. Communicating multidimensional results can be more complex than reporting one economic ratio. Managing competing criteria like equity versus efficiency requires a lot of careful facilitation and decision making because people might value these things differently, and so there has to be a process where people have a chance to work together to resolve these issues, to come to consensus, and to deliberate. And finally, some stakeholders resist qualitative or non-monetized forms of value. This idea of using qualitative processes to collect data, to understand costs, can be a little bit different for people who have just really traditionally thought of valuation and economic evaluation as being cost-benefit analysis or return on investment, things reduced down to common units. So when should you use VFI? Well, it's ideal when resource use is a primary concern, when multiple dimensions of value must be considered together, or when traditional cost-benefit analysis feels too narrow. On the other hand, VFI may not be appropriate when the evaluation purpose is extremely narrow or purely financial, or when data, time, or stakeholder conditions do not allow for the deliberative process. This is really about helping evaluators determine up front, whether VFI is fit for purpose. It isn't always the case that it is, and so it's a really deliberate decision about when to engage in this method and when it may not be the best choice. VFI is not a standalone approach or an ideology. It's an overarching framework of explicit evaluative reasoning that can sit on top of other evaluation approaches. For example, realist evaluation provides context, mechanism, outcomes insight that can feed into the rubrics. Theory-driven evaluation helps articulate pathways of value creation. Utilization-focused evaluation ensures that the evaluation reflects real decision needs. VFI works best when it can draw on these complementary traditions and these methods that have been very established to be able to center them around that valuation of resource allocation and use. VFI is currently being used globally. I did a search for different examples of VFI and also accessed the resources on Julian King's website and found about 14 publicly available value for investment or value for money reports that had advisement from the folks practicing value for investment. These reports came from places like New Zealand, Canada, Brazil, European Union, the UK, Mozambique, Pakistan. In the UK, VFI is now embedded in government-wide evaluation training. Even though adoption is slower in the United States, momentum is building internationally, and the conversation continues about cost-inclusive evaluation and how to continue to incorporate that, especially in the U.S. context. You might say to yourself, VFI sounds great. It's sure to be a popular choice among practicing evaluators, right? Yet we see that it is not widely adopted, especially in the United States. Why is this so? Many evaluators have never been trained in cost-inclusive methods, and many organizations are still unsure about how to apply them. So while the approach is promising, adoption requires learning, capacity building, and technical support for evaluators who would like to begin to incorporate costs and economic evaluation into their work. These statistics illustrate the gap in cost-inclusive evaluation. Less than 5% of published evaluations mention costs or cost effectiveness, and less than 1% of American Evaluation Association conference proposals are submitted to the Cost Effectiveness, Benefits, and Economics TIG. This gap is part of what VFI is designed to address. Evaluators often avoid cost-inclusive evaluation because they lack training or exposure to methods. Clients might worry about political sensitivities around financial data, and of course, time, money, and data constraints pose barriers just as they do in other evaluation settings. Yet these same constraints are why a structured approach, like VFI, is useful. Scriven famously said, "For many years I have referred to cost analysis as the missing half of quantitative evaluation." And that's an invitation for us as an evaluation community to move beyond these barriers and to begin to think about resource use and cost in our evaluations. We're in a political moment where public programs have to justify their resource use to continue receiving funding. VFI offers a way for evaluators to answer that call with rigor and transparency. By becoming more comfortable with cost-inclusive evaluation, we can help programs demonstrate their value and defend their merit, worth, and significance, allowing them to continue to exist and serve the people that they were created to serve. Looking ahead, there are major opportunities for further development of the VFI model. We need better ways to ensure comparability across VFI evaluations. Understanding how context-specific rubrics can be complemented with standardized indications when cross-program comparison is required. We need research on how VFI affects evaluation use and decision quality. How are evaluations using VFI comparing to non-VFI evaluations in terms of making decisions about resource allocation? Thinking about how to scale evaluator competencies with VFI. We need more training and capacity building for folks who want to be able to use this method. Similarly, we need more tools, rubrics, cost templates, how to create these things with the interest holders in a facilitated setting, protocols about having these deliberative discussions to support consistent implementation across settings. And as VFI continues to evolve, these areas offer rich opportunities for scholarship and practice. Thank you for listening to this video about value for investment evaluation.